Isaiah chapter 10, and the more you look at this, the more you are filled with wonder how, first of all, it is just exactly like you see it going on around you today. It is exactly like human nature is. It's exactly like nations degenerate. It's portraying the same things that we see in the news each and every day. Isaiah chapter 10, woe unto them that decree unrighteous decrees, and that write grievousness which they have prescribed, to turn aside the needy from judgment, and to take away the right from the poor of my people, that widows may be their prey, and that they may rob the fatherless. What will you do in the day of visitation, and in the desolation which shall come from far? To whom will you flee for help, and where will you leave your glory? Without me they shall bow down unto the prisoners, and they shall fall unto the slain. For all this his anger is not turned away, but his hand is stretched out still. That's the fourth time you see those words. For all this his anger is not turned away. This is chapter 10, verse 4, but in chapter 9, you saw it in verses 17, 21, and I think verse 4 as well. But it's the same thing, that God's hand is still stretched out, because it's funny that chastening hasn't changed people's hearts once they are fully set on rebellion, on ignoring the word of God. But this is a passage on tyranny, and it's just as appropriate today as in any day. And you'll see this is the case with every nation that falls apart. You look at the ruins of nations all over the world, and you can be sure that all of them did the same thing, in that it's exactly like this. Tyranny ends up where will you leave your glory? And afterwards, in verse 4, they shall bow down unto the prisoners. Frankly, the tyrants end up dying violent deaths. They end up dying terrible deaths. You say, well, there's some that don't. Yeah, but they still stand before God, don't they? But this is really from a natural standpoint. Have you seen what happened to Mussolini in World War II? They dragged him through the streets, hung him upside down with his girlfriend. So, I mean, he was oppressing people. What about Hitler? Well, he escaped to Argentina or wherever it was. I wonder about that. I suspect that too many people would have to be quiet and keep the secret for that to have happened. He probably died in the bunker, and they just hid his body and put another one there in his place. I don't know that, but I know this, that people that oppress folks around them end up dying violent deaths, and at the very best they're forgotten, or their memory is certainly soiled, isn't it? Now, we have seen, starting in chapter 7 and going through chapter 12, that prophecies that were given during the reign of Ahaz, a wicked king, and you see it traces and makes God's comments on the degradation of society. He addresses the immediate, what's going to happen to them, and because this is prior to the carrying away captive, but then he foretells the future as well, and we can see it paralleled in the future events of the book of Revelation. It's amazing how rebellion takes the same form in every place you'd care to look at it. It's always the same form. Nations always do the same thing, and we'll look at some verses that we've looked at many times already. Isaiah traces that, and what's interesting here, when it says, I like the verse, where will you leave your glory? You could ask yourself that, where are you going to leave your glory? Well, remember the context here is that they're able to oppress the poor and the widows. So the glory in the book of Proverbs, in another verse, I'll find it here. That glory sometimes has to do with what you've accumulated by in your estate. Just like Solomon said, why should I build such a big estate? I'm going to give it to someone, and I have no control over what they do with it. You're not going to take it with you. Where are you going to leave your glory? What is it that, and what a great subject matter for the last Wednesday night of our year. Where are you going to leave your glory? Is your glory going to be in monetary things or in physical things that'll stay right here and burn up? Or is it going to be in spiritual things where we use our efforts to promote Jesus Christ and his kingdom? And certainly that's what we want. That's what we work for, isn't it? That's why we have missionaries on the walls, and that's why we try to be a friend to missionaries. We want something that lasts, and it's a good, fair question, isn't it? Let's pray and ask God's blessing. Lord, would you bless us tonight? It's been prayed that I'd hide behind the cross, and I always want to do that. I want to lift up Jesus Christ in every way. I pray that you'd settle my mind and my heart. Lord, help me to speak. I'm kind of stammering here. I pray that you give me the words to speak. And may your spirit be and abide upon this place and speak through me to each heart. In Jesus' name, amen. You know, what's so interesting is that we tend not to think about the result, the consequences of what we're doing. The consequences of what we do right now can bear fruit for years to come and many times generations to come, won't they? We're looking at the book of Judges, and you see certain people raised up and they make a difference in their society. Not all of them died in a good way, but they made a difference in their society, didn't they? And at least for 40 years or for 20 years, they spared the nation further degradation. And we can do the same thing in our day, and I think we have an open window to do that today. We can make a difference in our day. Well, notice first of all the unjust judges that he's reproving. Verse 1, woe unto them that decree unrighteous decrees. In other words, people with pomp and circumstance decree something that's unholy, and that's been the last 4 years, hasn't it? Now, someone says, well, I don't like politics in church. Well, I'll tell you what, if my kids were in public school, I would not like knowing that the teachers could take a little child and change his gender without ever talking to me about it. That's what's been happening. That's what's been happening. And you say, well, that's not all over the country. If it happens one time, that's too much. And by the way, it's already been that way about abortions. They decree unrighteous decrees, and we could go into a lot of other things as well, can't we? We could go into the very fact that they leave a porous border so that people come in here, and I think I saw 117,000 people died last year from fentanyl that comes through Mexico with the parts being made in China coming over here. 117,000 people, and we want to be loving and kind to bring people inside the border, let them have a place of refuge. They decree unrighteous decrees. We could go through a lot of other things, couldn't we? We could go through all kinds of things. When you look at where tax money has been going, where you look at all this stuff, this is judges that decree unrighteous decrees, or at least people that decree them. And the next part says, and that write grievousness. So the people that record them may not be the same as the one that decree them, but they are unrighteousness, and they're starting to call evil good and good evil. And that's what happens. We'll turn to Isaiah 59 eventually. We've looked at that many times. They call evil good and good evil. We see that today. I saw that the state of Washington, before he leaves office, he's going to try to tax people if they have a home that they own in Florida, even though they live in Washington. So how do you have the jurisdiction to tax in a completely different jurisdiction than here? They are so frantic to get money because they spend more money than they ever take in. It's unrighteous decrees, isn't it? They're ungodly decisions. Now, remember the standard for this. Two passages. Look at Romans chapter 13, and you're familiar with this. Romans chapter number 13, and it speaks about the powers that be, but I want you to notice the very words here. Romans chapter 13, and it says in verse 1, it says, let every soul be subject unto the higher powers, for there is no power but of God. The powers that be are ordained of God. Now remember, our text, our context is during the reign of Ahaz, who was a wicked king. He was next in line for the throne, and his position is a position of authority, and he's responsible for what he does, but God raises and lowers. What concerns me all the time is how often we get what we deserve, not what we want. And I'm sure that's happened a lot in our country, hasn't it? But you notice this, be subject to the higher powers. There's no power but of God. The powers that be are ordained of God. Whosoever therefore resisteth the power, resisteth the ordinance of God, and they that resist shall receive to themselves damnation. Now, this was written by Paul, who spent a lot of time in prison. He was in prison, how often? Often. He didn't even tell us the number of times. So obviously, he's speaking about the ordained powers of a king, and God gives them that power. Now notice what God says about that king. For rulers are not a terror to good works. I've seen people that were arrested at gunpoint in front of the family of 7 children at 6 in the morning when they volunteered to come in just for questioning with all kinds of assault weapons pointed at them because he held a sign up in front of an abortion clinic. That's going through the courts right now. and he would happily have come in. He told them that. They do this to make an example so other people will toe the line. But it says rulers, what God ordains a ruler for is he's not to be a terror to good works, but to the evil. In other words, he's supposed to restrain evil doing. That's what God ordained government to do. Wilt thou then not be afraid of the power? Do that which is good, and thou shalt have praise of the same. Now, notice the next verse, for he is the minister of God to thee for good. One of those tracks we have out there is us on Son of Sam. And I remember when he was raging in New York City, he'd jump up in front of a car and take care of everyone inside. I'm going to leave it that way. Okay? And he had calling cards. They finally captured him and his testimony. If you want to read something interesting, read that. He was into Satan worship and Satanism and all that stuff until someone preached the gospel to him in prison, and now he's an advocate for Jesus Christ. And everything I can see about it looks genuine. But you know what that prison did for him? It was God's minister to change his life. What we do, we forget sometimes that can change some and be a real remedial effect, have a remedial effect on people's lives and directions. And oftentimes you see, especially with smaller infractions, where people finally have to answer for their stupidity, and it changes their lives. But it says he's your minister. Well, this desk is a ministry, isn't it? So is the ruler. But look, if you will, at 1 Peter chapter 2. 1 Peter chapter 2. Now, this is talking about suffering. 1 Peter chapter number 2 and verse 14. It says, verse 13, submit yourselves to every ordinance of man for the Lord's sake, whether it be to the king as supreme, or unto governors as unto them that are sent by him for the punishment of evildoers and the praise of them that do well. For so is the will of God, that ye may with well-doing put to silence, you may put to silence the ignorance of foolish men. Now, notice this, the governors are sent to punish evildoers and praise those that do well. When was the last time you saw someone praised for, say, preaching on the street corner? When was the last time you saw someone praised, in the public realm, for standing up for Jesus Christ? Or you can fill in the blank there. We don't see that anymore. We see it backwards. You praise the ones that are perverted, and you punish the ones that stand up against it. That's what Isaiah is talking about. Woe unto them to decree unrighteous decrees, and that write grievousness which they have prescribed. Prescribed is like a prescription. This is what's supposed to happen. This is what we want. They're prescribing it. You look at the ungodly decisions. It's a horrible thing. They're supposed to be there for good. Rulers are supposed to be a terror to those who do evil. They should be afraid of them. And even 30 and 40 and 50 years ago, I remember criminals saying, I didn't care if I got caught, even if it was for murder, because it would take at least 20 years before I ever felt anything except 3 squares a day in prison. And that's if you got caught. It's not a terror to evil works anymore. Think about someone lighting someone on fire on the subway this week and then watching them burn. That's what's going on in our country today, and too many people don't have the heart to do anything about it. I think there's a reason for that too. If we get to, we'll get to it. Proverbs 17:26 says, punishing the just is not good. Well, that should go without saying, shouldn't it? Punishing the just is not good. And what's interesting in Isaiah is in Romans 13, where it talks about the powers that be and all this. Verse 11, it says, it's time for us to wake up. It's time to wake up. Too much of what happens because good men don't do anything. It's not that good men quit doing good and start doing evil, actively doing evil. It's because we don't do anything. We don't do anything. So rulers would be a terror. And we have records all over the Bible and in secular history, the same thing. When someone gets into a predicament, they give excuses for it. And you see, with the aid of phony officials and ungodly decrees, that there is a degeneration of society. I was reading one readable commentary on this passage, and he said, and this would have been 30 or 40 years ago, it's not even safe to have your wife walk down the street at night. Well, that was 30 or 40 years ago. What is it today? I mean, 40 years ago, I had friends in church. I had a Mexican friend in church that says, oh, that's East LA. I don't even go there because of the Mexican gangs, and he's a Mexican. That's 40 years ago. It's gone downhill from there, hasn't it? It keeps going downhill. We see the records of that and the degeneration that goes downhill. And yet it says, you write the grievousness which they have prescribed. That means the unjust judges are doing this intentionally. What is the sanity of doing that intentionally? Well, I can show you books, at least 2 different books. One of them traces Hitler's rise to power and the philosophy behind that, and another one is written by it's called Rules for Radicals. I forget his name now. Rules for Radicals, and he influenced Barack Obama when he was in college. And it says your objective is to make the unrest so horrible in a community that they'll take anything for the remedy. That's what we're seeing. So they are always trying to suppress the Second Amendment, the right to keep and bear arms. So did Hitler. So did Mao. So did Mussolini. All of them did that. Why? It's a whole lot easier. It's just like hijackers. They don't try to go hijack army vehicles because they're armed. They would hijack an airplane because they've guaranteed no one's on there that's armed. Okay? It is intentional. What kind of evil does it take to intentionally destroy society? And by the way, it gets worse in these 4 verses as well. Unjust judges that give license to criminals and restrain the godly. It's a terrible thing. Look at number 2, in verse 2. This is their purpose. It's prescribed to turn aside the needy from judgment. In other words, it is to void the ability of those in need to have what's done, to have what is right done for them. To have what's right done. Now you saw the guy got off. I don't know why. I can't help. I didn't plan to say most of this. The guy that got off for protecting some people on a subway a year ago, and he grabbed a guy in a chokehold and he ended up dying. They prosecuted him. They prosecuted him. Of course, that was New York, I believe, where the clowns run the circus. But they prosecuted him. This is to turn aside the needy from judgment. You know what that's going to do? Especially with, look at the atmosphere for police officers today. For police officers, they have to treat every vehicle as a potential threat to their lives. And there's going to be, I can't imagine them not having a hesitation if their life might be in danger because of all the paperwork they're going to have to do. You might say, well, that wouldn't happen, but it says to turn aside the needy from judgment. In other words, to prevent people that are in need from having judgment done in their behalf. There is a purpose in the unjust judges. It is to abandon those in need, to abandon them. Why? There's no resolution. There's no resolution. There's no hope then. There's an unnecessary burden that they have to carry. And what it does is it emboldens people to do evil. I know in the state of Washington, the police officers can't even, if you call them because someone is stealing your car from your garage, unless they see that person stealing the car, they can't do anything. Now, what's the chance that they get there in time to see someone stealing the car? What that means is they just go anywhere. They go and do whatever they want to. It is to abandon those in need. Isn't it nice to live in good old Montana, where we're not quite as far progressed as many of the areas of our country? It emboldens those that are evil. But not only that, remember, this is their purpose, to turn aside the needy from judgment, to take away the right from the poor of my people. So the poor people have to deal with poverty, and at the same time, they're going to get abused intentionally by other people. That's the reason for it. Why? Because that way, when people get in terrible need, they'll have anyone come in and do anything if they promise peace. That's what's going on in our country today. Well, it will for another 3 weeks or so, 4 weeks. Okay? To abuse the poor. They don't have any resources to fight. They're poor. And you know what's interesting is when MSNBC had to pay $16 million to settle that suit for Trump, you know? $1 million. You know what it was for? Lawyers' fees. How many people would be able to absorb $1 million in lawyers' fees to defend yourself? That's what's going on. It's an abomination. Abuse the poor. Now, I can't say Trump is poor, but you understand, if it's $1 million for him, I know people that have spent $50,000 to prove absolutely vapid charges. And you're subject to lawyers' fees. If you can't afford a lawyer, you ought to be in court when you don't have a lawyer. I can tell you this, if you're in court on a criminal prosecution, they want to put you in jail, if you don't want a lawyer, they will force one on you. You know why? Because the law says they can't put you in jail if you don't have a lawyer. So if you don't want a lawyer, you want to defend yourself, they'll make you have a lawyer because their purpose is to put you in jail. Now, no resources to fight. Unrighteous decrees make all the decisions very expensive. And you'd find yourself fighting with your resources, which are limited, against a court that wants you proven guilty. And we see that all the time. And the poor have no access. Frankly, they're given no hope. You wonder why the poor of our country swells in its ranks. You take away all the hope, and the government says they'll take care of you, and you'll sign anything just to get the care that they promise you, and it does nothing but destroy you. Just remember, the numbers prove this. When they declared war on poverty, in the black neighborhoods that they said they were going to fix, they had 20% single-parent families. Now, after trillions of dollars, it's 80% single-parent families. Just think about that. It's 4 times as bad now since they started fighting it. Why? Well, they just subsidize bad behavior. It makes a man unnecessary in a home. And you can go right down the line, and thoroughly entrenches welfare, which destroys the family. And you can say that without being willing to watch people starve. I'm not willing to watch people starve. But remember, in the old days, they'd come to church and we'd help them as much as we could. Didn't they? Today, they go to handouts from the government and put the burden upon everyone who actually is working. No hope. Do you understand how desperate it would be if you had no hope? If you had no hope? I know what James has had to go through in the prognoses and the horrible cancer he has, the horrible side effects, first of the first treatment, then the radiation, and his radiation, I think, ends a week from Tuesday maybe, or Wednesday. You have to deal with despair. That's what he told me. This is horrible. I've got almost 2 more years of this. Well, that's not because he did something criminal or stupid. That's just the fact that we're children of Adam with bodies that grow old. Think of what hope there is. What's wrong with our country is people don't have hope. Look at how much hope is now bandied about. I think even maybe by those that are far left but don't have the resources to threaten to leave the country and still stay here. There's hope now. Okay, maybe the crime's going to go down a little. I know it wouldn't have gone down if it had gone the other way. Do you think it would have? There's hope. Maybe there's hope that the economy gets better. It did before. There's hope now, isn't there? And that's just earthly things. What about spiritual hope? When you get people this down, that's not what brings revival. It might get to the place where they cry out to God, but they cried out to God, they got peace, but that doesn't mean they had revival, does it? And you keep going. You take away the right from the poor of my people, that widows may be their prey and that they may rob the fatherless. The purpose of unrighteous decrees is to make victims out of the ones that can't help themselves. To make well, how in the world can the poor people have anything that I can steal? Well, it's not necessarily their assets. There are things you can steal, can't you? Steal their lives, steal their property. They build power this way so that folks get desperate enough that they'll accept anything. And their formula is this: exploit the defenseless. Widows. Think about the widows. Think about the widows. The widows in our midst, they still tear up at the thought of their departed husband, don't they? And that's the kind that these people take advantage of. Do you know how many people get on the phone, and I don't even know how many people have talked to me about this. We'll come and put a roof on your house. It'll cost you this amount of money. You pay them the money and you never see them again. How can someone do that? How can people do that? These are people that decree unrighteous decrees. They do it intentionally to build power and make the defenseless easy prey. The widows. Look at Psalm 68, verse 4. Psalm 68 and verse 4. Psalm 68 and verse 4. It says, sing unto God, sing praises to his name, extol him that rideth upon the heavens by his name Jah, and rejoice before him, a father of the fatherless. Our God's the father of those with no father. A judge of the widows is God in his holy habitation. He is a judge to defend the widows and the fatherless. So when these people speak of when the Bible speaks of woe to them, you're setting yourself against the God who cares about those people when you do not. When you do not. So they take advantage of the widows. Matthew 23, that's what the Pharisees did. They weren't just godless reprobate kings. They were godless reprobate religious leaders that pretended to be really fundamental. They took advantage of the widows. The widows still have that. Hey, if you take everything the widow has, then their family has to take them in. Or I don't know what their thinking is. Oftentimes the widows have the remaining estate of their departed husband. These are people that are trying to pillage the ones that can't defend themselves. James tells us, true religion undefiled before God the Father is this, to visit the widows and fatherless and visit them in their affliction, to visit them, to be a friend to those people, to be a friend to them. What about the fatherless? You know, the Bible tells us that a man's job and duty. It should be his joy to provide for his home. Otherwise, he's worse than an infidel. There's no evidence of faith in him if he can't even provide for his own home, or won't even provide for his own home. The fatherless are very precious in God's sight, aren't they? The widows are very precious in his sight because he's the champion for the downtrodden. Every program that they've come up with to help the poor has hurt them. Every time. And by the way, punishment of evil is not the same thing as a bureaucracy. Man, I've watched a few news reports about how entrenched the bureaucracy is. I really don't think they'd have any trouble cutting $1 trillion out of the budget right now. From what I have seen, hundreds of millions of dollars to study animals in China or wherever. You know why they get away with that? Because you don't know about it. It's hidden in a bill somewhere, and that means it greases someone's palms, which in turn brings money back to them somehow. Well, then it gives a next point, that is consideration. Look at verse 3. What will you do in the day of visitation? What will you do in the day of visitation? That means there's a day of accounting coming. What are you going to do in the day of visitation? Acts 17:31, God's appointed a day. God's appointed a day. What on earth was that? That's a new one. There's another one. Sam, is that you? Hey, there's a payday coming one day, isn't there? And you know, what we naturally would like to see is these people that are so evil stand before God. But when heaven and hell hang in the balance, I still hate to see them go to hell. That's why God wrote this book. To arrest people from the direction they're going, but you've got to stop long enough to think. There's a day of accounting coming. Hebrews 9:27, it's appointed a man once to die, but after this, the judgment. Does a denial of God, if you do it long enough, are you able to defeat any judgment that might come? No. You're going to stand before God one day. You know the truth. And now they're having to answer for criminals that were caught coming across the border. They were convicted criminals and they released them into the public, and then they went and killed someone. Oh, we're never happy about a death. You could have done something about it, and you intentionally did not. How could you justify that? Well, we don't have the resources. You're the one that opened the border. We don't have the resources. Because they want people to get so nervous about the crime on the streets that, okay, everyone surrenders their guns. Well, I think spoons make people fat. I saw that today. If spoons make people fat, then we should outlaw spoons. Don't you think? That makes as much sense. And I saw a whole list of these things. Cars make people reckless. Outlaw cars. Anyway, you never know what's going to pop up in my head. Catch and release for murders. Do people really think that's right? And you look at the mental gyrations that these people do, trying not to answer the questions when they know good and well the evidence is there that what they've done is not only wrong, it's foolish and wicked. And, you know, with all this stuff, when you know that Congress makes you have a health care system that they don't have to have. They foist upon us health care that they get to opt out of and use their own. Most of what they foist, oh yeah, I've seen this. You mean your security detail can have weapons that you will not allow my wife to have in our home? Have you seen that one? And they will say, our police officer outgunned. That's not what I asked. It's a separation, it's a distinction made between those that are passing the stupid laws and the people that are oppressed by them. There's an accounting coming one day. The kids are not going to be treated fairly. Do you suppose that they would, without Obama's approval or knowledge, that they would have imposed some kind of gender transition on one of his daughters? I doubt it, because it's not what you know, it's who you know. And all that happens is people get more and more weak until they're defeated. That's constantly the testimony of history. Because people will not look at their latter end, as Deuteronomy says. Oh, that they were wise, that they would look at consider their latter end. Well, they become helpless, don't they? They become helpless. In the desolation which shall come from far, to whom will you flee for help? Where will you leave your glory? They'll end up helpless, and where are you going to leave your glory? You know, if they accumulate all the possessions of all the world through fraud, they're not taking it with them. And unless you earned it, unless children learn early to work, the children are usually going to squander it, aren't they? If it costs you nothing, it doesn't take any thought to spend it. So where are you going to leave your glory? Some of that is in possessions. What about reputation? I am convinced right now that there is such a war going on behind the scenes in Washington because Biden felt betrayed by his own party. And all that was pretty much undemocratic, wasn't it? And he'll do what he can to get even with them. He doesn't like the fact that Trump wins, so he's doing everything he can to sell things off and make things as difficult, trying to foment war, it looks like. But he keeps going down in people's esteem, doesn't he? He was thought of as a doddering old grandfather. And now people count the days down till he's out of office. And he's taken so many down with him. Isn't it funny that Trump was a threat to democracy? And then immediately after he was elected, they said, well, I'm going to be a friend to you and we'll work together. I thought he was a threat to democracy. Biden cites politics about Hunter. Oh, I'm going to abide by the jury's rule. And then he says, no, this was a politically motivated thing, but it's not for Trump. Isn't that amazing? And yet, the majority of people said the charges are ridiculous. You say, what does that have to do with the Bible? This is what happens when you go off the page of what's right and what's wrong. Ultimately, it all equals out. That's the last verse, verse 4. Without me they shall bow down unto the prisoners. Now, is that a position of strength? You're being crushed by the prisoners. You're going to be thrown in the common grave. You're going to be part of the results of the destruction. They bow down unto the prisoners, and they shall fall under the slain. They're probably going to just die a common death. They won't be remembered fondly, like the one king who died and was not even missed. And for all this, his anger is not turned away, but his hand is stretched out still. Once again, you see in the book of Isaiah, God sending a prophet with great abilities, great speaking ability. The prince of the prophets speaking from God's own heart by a guy who saw God high and lifted up, saw the future as God showed it to him, and now he's speaking to them out of love for them at great cost to himself, and they turn their back on God. They turn their back on God. We see it today, all the time, all the time. People turning their backs on God. They bow unto the prisoners, they fall unto the slain. Basically, they're trodden under. And without the Lord, there's no place to flee, is there? There's no place to run. His anger is not turned. For all this, his judgment is still not finished. Probably there's no repentance here either. And that's a sad thing, isn't it? You can find it really amazing that folks that are fighting, when you walk up to the door to invite them to church, tell you, we're good. I've had that happen many times. Hey, we're good. I do marriage counseling too. No, really. They'll say, we're good. They will not turn. I don't know how many times I've talked to people and present them the gospel, they understood the gospel, and they don't want to give up something in this life even though they're miserable. Why would we be surprised that that's what they did in that nation? It was their land. But the same judgment's coming. And I'm telling you what, like in Romans 13, where it says, it's time to wake out of sleep. The time is short. The time was short 2,000 years ago. What is it now? Man, Jesus could come any day, and that'd be great, wouldn't it? But he's still warning. And even though his hand is stretched out, he's still stretched out in judgment. But he's also always willing to show mercy, as the book of Judges shows. As the book of Judges shows, all over the Bible. Let's pray.